pretty much filed in here. So again, we're really grateful to be here with Seth Kim, Assistant Professor of Cinema Studies at Colby College, to talk about The Way of the Gun. I hope all of you have had a chance to see it, if not for the first time over the past week, for the second or third time since it was released back in 2000. And it's a pleasure to welcome you here. So Seth, I'm just going to go ahead and turn it over to you. I know you have some materials and some thoughts prepared for us tonight to kind of kick off this discussion. So thanks for being here. Thanks for doing this.
Yeah, thanks, Mike, for that introduction, and thank you and Julia for having me. I think this is great. Thanks to the Maine Film Center and Railroad. I think it'll be a really rich series. So I'm going to go ahead and talk about, I have some slides prepared. I'm going to talk about the film, and then I'm going to kind of go from the film a little bit more broadly to the film's relationship to the last 20 years, basically, of American history. And specifically, in order to kind of talk about how Way of the Gun provides insight into our, current historical moment. And what I'm looking to do is I want us to use all of this as a sort of opportunity to reconsider some of the dominant notions that we have regarding a few things, namely like three big things, which would be militarization, the process of militarization that has been sort of a really key topic in the country for the last few years, and then also firearms and firearm culture. And also, even more broadly, the relationship between film and reality. So I'll go ahead and I'll share my screen, and then we'll do questions. And so, please. Okay. So The Way of the Gun was not really successful when it was on its initial release, but it has found a kind of a second life as a cult film, but also, interestingly enough, within kind of firearm culture in the U.S. And you can kind of see that in not only with McQuarrie and the films that he goes on to do, which is the first Jack Reacher film he directs, and then now he's responsible for the Mission Impossible franchise. And already there, like between the relationship between Tom Cruise and McQuarrie, that's already kind of this huge other thread that we can and we can pick up on that in the Q&A. But also in the fact that, Ryan Phillippe at this point, he had just come off of I Know What You Did Last Summer, and also Cruel Intentions. And so he had this sort of, teeny bopper sort of image that he then kind of cast aside for this. A few years ago, he did the USA series Shooter, based on the Mark Wahlberg vehicle, and also the book of the same name. More interestingly, very recently, he did a film called The Second, and it's exactly what it sounds like, where it's this kind of schlocky action film that's about the Second Amendment under fire. Benicio del Toro does The Hunted a few years after this, which is another kind of, I would very much recommend. That would be another film that I could do, like, I could have done, this sort of discussion about, in the sense that it's another film that's very similar, that kind of doesn't really register when it comes out, but it also is very much, I think, related to the kind of post-2001 milieu. And then, of course, more recently, he did the two Sicario films. So, to talk about the legacy of The Way of the Gun, let's see. There we go. So specifically this sequence, the moving sequence, when they're at Dr. Painter's office, this is one that's kind of held up as one of the key set pieces of the film. And specifically, it's the way that Longbaugh and Parker, or the Del Toro and Phillippe character, move through the space, the sort of tactical awareness that brought this sort of degree of detail that wasn't really commonplace in dominant media, whether American or otherwise, by the turn of the century. And so between this sequence and then the kind of set piece at the end, the way that they're handling their firearms, the way that they're engaging in combat, The Way of the Gun was really an outlier at this point. But now it's become kind of standard. The degree of sophistication that you see in this film is now really commonplace, which is kind of really what I want to be talking about. And I hesitate to say, because a lot of commentators would suggest that that the film is realistic, and we'll see this just in a moment. But I would suggest that it's not necessarily that it's realistic so much as that the practices in the film have now become commonplace in actual sort of let's say firearm kind of disciplines and training, whether it's the military, whether it's law enforcement, whether it's civilian. And so there's still kind of, and I mean, I'm kind of jumping all over the place, but because it's dominant, it's very easy for us to say, well, that's real, but that's not necessarily what it is. It's just, in hindsight now, we kind of look at sort of what's considered the outdated modes, which was what was being represented, throughout the 20th century as kind of hokey or fake, but that's not necessarily true. And so you can see this, for example, this is a page from a blog, and you can see that it's like a gun culture blog, Pew Pew Tactical, and the blog post was the 4 most realistic gun scenes in movies, and in parentheses, and some ridiculous ones. And I want you to note from the very beginning, Michael Mann, who will become kind of really important to this conversation. But Way of the Gun, even though despite the fact that it didn't really find an audience in 2000, has since, now has been sort of taken up. And again, by this sort of interesting kind of, 2 different audiences, like, people that are gun enthusiasts, and also, kind of cult movies / like, 90s films, because the film is very much of its time. Like McQuarrie is very much in dialogue with his contemporaries, like Quentin Tarantino, or someone like Doug Liman, who he also intersects with, along with Tom Cruise and Bryan Singer as well. Excuse me. And so here's another image. This is from the website IMFDB, the Internet Movie Firearm Database. And it's just, it's this extensive kind of archive of just all of the firearms used across, mass culture, games, television, film, and it's just incredibly detailed. But if you look at the Way of the Gun, the page for Way of the Gun, a lot of it is really about the techniques and how sophisticatedly the actors were trained. James Caan, Del Toro, Philippi, also Nicky Katt and Taye Diggs. And so, I just use this one as an example because we're seeing that there's the kind of invocation of Caan's sort of high level of training, but also the sort of dig at, well, Hollywood is really fake, but Way of the Gun is not. And so here's an image of director Christopher McQuarrie with Tom Cruise. And again, just to give you a sense of what I mean, is that if you watch just the Mission Impossible franchise, which goes from the 90s into the 2010s, you see the change of gun culture or gun representation in cinema within, how many films is it now? Is it six films, 7 films? Correct me if I'm wrong, I'm terrible with numbers. And so, and one of the really interesting jumps is between Mission Impossible 2, when he works with John Woo, so it's that kind of, operatic, bombastic, heavily stylized John Woo style of gunplay, and then in Mission Impossible 3, which is the film that he does with J.J. Abrams, and that's the film where it goes a complete 180, and the film is just as sophisticated, and perhaps even more than Way of the Gun. And what happens in between is that Cruise actually works with Michael Mann. He does Collateral. And so, I mean, I would need to do archival research to kind of back this up, but I get the sense that, Cruise kind of gloms onto the more sort of, let's say, highly trained version of filmic gunplay, and sort of carries that on into all of his movies, even the science fiction ones like Oblivion. If you look at the gun handling, it's science fiction, it's lasers and whatnot, but it's still being done in what we would refer to as the modern way. And so another key personnel is, this is Doug McQuarrie on the right. So this is Christopher McQuarrie's brother. This is actually on the set of one of the Mission Impossible films. And Hollywood has a long tradition of technical advisors, generally that come from the military, sometimes law enforcement, and they come in. And this is not just a late 20th century thing. This goes back to the mid 20th century. It goes back to Westerns, goes back to military and war films as well. But these personnel that come in and are there to kind of ensure a sort of high degree of verisimilitude, that the people, that's the role of these actors, right, is that they kind of have to know, they have to look like they know what they're doing, right? And so Doug McQuarrie, he is ex-military, he's a former Navy SEAL. He brings the kind of, his expertise and training to Way of the Gun, which has now become kind of commonplace. And again, I mean, I think one of the reasons that the film doesn't look terribly dated is precisely because of the way that all the principal actors are moving through the space, that it doesn't look hokey. Whereas one of my examples would be something like if you look at Silence of the Lambs, 1991, that already looks outdated, again, because our sense of what is realistic has changed. And so even though it's not that that film is inaccurate in its portrayal of law enforcement, it just doesn't fit our kind of current sensibilities. And so moving on to Michael Mann, and the thing is that Way of the Gun is very much again, like I said, it's an outlier. That's one of the reasons that I find the film kind of fascinating, and where we're going with this is that after 2001, it's harder now. I can throw a rock and it's harder to find a film with poor gun training. But before 2001, that wasn't the case, and the only person in town that was really doing this was Michael Mann. And then Christopher McQuarrie comes around with his brother Doug, and Michael Mann, his sort of, I guess would say, kind of muse, because Michael Mann is someone himself who's sort of versed in gunplay, would be Jeff Cooper, who's passed away, but he's also ex-military. He's a colonel in the, I forget, I could be Navy or Air Force. But he's someone known to be the quote unquote father of modern handgun shooting, and he develops the Gun Sight Academy out of Arizona, which becomes this sort of like mecca for firearm culture in the U.S. And he is most credited in the United States as the developer of what's referred to as the modern technique of the pistol. He also refers it to as pistolcraft or defensive handgunning. And so another way to think of the modern technique is a sort of discipline or a set of tactics and techniques and practices that Cooper popularizes. And the key kind of part of this is that already, we see this kind of interesting relationship between military and civilian in the sense of, or ex-military, right? So civilian, and civilians in cinema, and the way that gun culture is sort of proliferating through there. The other part of it is that these sort of techniques that we identify or associate with the modern technique or modern kind of handgun culture, they don't actually come from the military, nor do they actually come from law enforcement. Research will actually show that you can read accounts that it was up until the 1970s that in the, like, for example, the FBI and American law enforcement agencies, they weren't using what was being like the modern technique. They were still using what would be referred to as point shooting. And we can talk about the kind of details, but I don't think they're as important right now. But suffice to say, it's basically in the 70s, or even up until the 70s, American law enforcement and even military dominant techniques were more akin to the kind of like what you would see in films before 2001. Meanwhile, beginning in the sort of 1950s in California, mostly California is the sort of hotbed for numerous reasons to the discussion today. It's the civilian sector and a lot of military on their own time. Well, not military, but a lot of law enforcement on their own time that are kind of contributing to the development of what we recognize as handgun combat. And so what I would suggest is handgun combat, as we kind of recognize it, is fundamentally a 20th century sort of phenomenon. And more importantly, it's not one that really comes out of law enforcement and military in the way that we would think that, that they're the vanguard and then civilians follow. It really comes out of civilian shooting culture. My kind of favorite sort of example of ways to identify the impact and sort of popularity of the modern technique and Jeff Cooper's sort of teachings. And just a side note, but Cooper and Michael Mann kind of intersect beginning in 1981 with Thief, with Mann's first theatrical release film. Although and this will become important similarly, is that Cooper actually, so Mann reportedly sends James Caan to Arizona to Gun Sight to train with Cooper. Cooper actually refuses, and his refusal is basically allegedly Cooper said there's no way that a criminal or a career thief would be privy to the sort of training that we do here, to that high level of training. So again, already, these sort of notions of like proper training, but who gets that proper training, and related to the film, to Way of the Gun, that's one of the things that sticks out to me watching it now, is that, both Parker and Longbaugh are kind of configured as sort of two-bit hoods, and yet they're incredibly good at what they do, right? They're kind of lowlifes, and the opening scene sort of sets that up really quickly. And yet, I mean, as operatives, right, as operators, I mean, they're just like basically, at an incredibly high caliber. So, but here, if you look at the image, this is Benicio del Toro in The Way of the Gun. That forefinger extended across the trigger guard, that is referred to as trigger discipline, which is like the idea embedded in this is that you never actually put your finger on the trigger unless you are willing to pull the trigger and kill, whatever or whomever is on the other side of the barrel. Now, again, it's very, very difficult to find images, whether it's actual images, historical images, media images of people holding firearms and not observing trigger discipline. But before 2000 and outside of Michael Mann's films, you would see fingers on triggers all the time. It's just something that people were not kind of mindful of. And similar to say, I would not suggest that Michael Mann or Christopher McQuarrie are single-handedly responsible for trigger discipline becoming ubiquitous. But I'm just like identifying historically, these are the texts where they kind of, proliferate. And similarly, Jeff Cooper didn't invent trigger discipline, but the modern technique is where he sort of aggregated all these like, many kind of, let's say tactics, techniques, and ideas. And those are that kind of body of knowledge becomes sort of proliferated throughout. And so, I would say, kind of in conjunction with Way of the Gun, and perhaps to a higher degree, the film that really sort of dictates, culture in the year since would be Heat's 1995 film Heat, or Michael Mann's 1995 film Heat. And again, like just a study on Heat, we could be here for hours about the way that it's impacted, both just culture in general, but mass culture. I actually wanted to include a clip, but we found out very quickly that clips aren't great on Zoom. So this is just an image of the kind of infamous, notorious sequence in the middle of the film when Robert De Niro and his gang of bank robbers rob a bank in downtown Los Angeles and have to fend off the LAPD. It's like a 6-minute or 8-minute sequence. And it was a landmark sequence because, again, for me, it's partially because of how well the actors are trained, and De Niro had been trained on the set of Ronin as well. But also because aesthetically, the sound design and how it kind of creates that sense of space, the sort of, there's that scene in Fight Club where they talk about, or I guess where it's about the sort of popular idea of what violence sounds like is not necessarily, doesn't really map on to what real violence sounds like. And I think this film did a similar thing where it sort of challenges dominant notions of what gunfire sounds like and what combat sounds like, right? But there's a much more, I would say a disquieting relationship that Heat has, and it's not necessarily, it's very easy and it happens all the time. It happened with Old Boy and Cho Seung-hee, the Virginia Tech shooter, or with the Batman films and the Aurora shooting. With Holmes, I don't think it's simply a monkey see, monkey do, but Heat was absolutely a part of the 1997 North Hollywood shootout, where Larry Eugene Phillips Jr. and Emil Mattisarenu fended off the LAPD for 44 minutes in downtown LA after robbing the Bank of America. And it was purely, it wasn't a training issue. I would suggest it was entirely due to their superior armament. This is of interest for us. Why? Because this is really kind of the catalyst, or becomes kind of legitimation for the armament of the LAPD. This is from the LAPD's website. So the acquisition and use of basically military grade gear, specifically fully automatic assault rifles. These are all variations of the same rifle. We'll talk about that further later on. But because, you know, the LAPD were equipped with their handguns and shotguns, you know, it becomes this thing where it's like, well, we need better equipment because the criminal element is becoming better equipped. That it becomes just sort of like, you know, kind of arms race. I mean, that is what it is, right? We know where this goes, right? And we see this, we've seen this time and time again in the last 10 years. This is, of course, one of the infamous images that come out of Ferguson. This is an image from Seattle, from Portland, or Portland rather. Kenosha, there's a similar kind of thing going on, and I didn't include an image just because you don't see the exact same gear, but if you know, not only the kind of gear that the officers are actually, you know, on their body, but specifically the weaponry they're using, again, all the same rifle types, which become a bigger kind of thing. But you know, already you can see that I'm trying to kind of make this connection, you know, from Heat to the LA, you know, shootout and into our current moment. And as I've already sort of hinted at, that it's not necessarily that films are copying military and law enforcement. To go back to Heat, one of these sort of, and it's in the featurette, one of the making of featurettes, and again, another clip that I had where Val Kilmer kind of very proudly talks about how Heat, the film, and that sequence is used almost as a training tool. And for me, you know, again, like if we were to you know, as a responsible film researcher, in order to kind of, you know, decisively say that this is, you know, that this actually happened, we would have to do, you know, far more research. But for me, it's less important whether that happened or not, and more that there's already this kind of relationship being mapped about, you know, even the idea, right? And that it becomes popularized. And this is another, this is actually a military culture blog. I think it's actually run by veterans. But that would be popularly accepted, right? That a film, right, that actors could be used as an example, right? That it's to that degree, that it's not that necessarily just that actors are using military personnel to kind of model themselves, but it's also going in the other way, right? And so I'm bringing all this up to just kind of suggest, you know, maybe we need to kind of, or just the possibility that it's not necessarily that, you know, when we talk about film and media as representation and reality, it's not necessarily that media represents reality or media reflects reality, but that it's a much more dynamic and even kind of sometimes, you know, contingent relationship, that it's not a chicken or egg, but rather that's kind of like both at the same time. And to this, just a few other examples where we see, you know, like military and law enforcement invoke cinema and media. This is an image of Chris Kyle, the most decorated sniper in American military history, who was the subject, right, of the Bradley Cooper Clint Eastwood American Sniper. And you can see in the corner on the left the Punisher logo from Marvel, the Marvel Comics character. And this in and of itself has become the way that skull and what that represents, and in relation to the character, that has become something that's been an issue as well. The original creator, it's escaping me now, I want to say it's Len Wein, but I could be wrong on that too. But he's, you know, come out and spoken about it, and how he doesn't approve. This is an image from Cattlesburg, Kentucky. This became an issue as well, that the actual the police department had the Punisher logo brandished on their actual squad cars, right? And so what I'm trying to kind of parse out as we get here is, and you know, is what is sort of embedded, like why this would become an ethical or political problem, namely that you know, the police would have the Punisher logo, is that it suggests a sort of orientation, right, towards the community. And what I mean by this is that, you know, what is the Punisher? For one, he was originally conceived as a villain, and then it became too popular, so they had to kind of, you know, recreate him as a hero or an anti-hero. But this was someone who took his vigilantism, as opposed to the normal vigilantism, right, of Spider-Man or Daredevil, to the limit, right, where it's like every criminal was something that had to be eradicated, that had to be killed with extreme, with zero prejudice, or zero tolerance, extreme prejudice, right? And so this sends out the sort of wrong image to members of the community, in the sense that is that how the police department is thinking of itself as the Punisher with and in relation to everyone else, and the sort of troubling evidence points to that sort of ideology is now not terribly exceptional, but fairly kind of ordinary and even commonplace. And what we're talking about is this this kind of us versus them, self and other distinction. But the key thing, and this is why I the work of historians is so crucial, and I'm thinking specifically of Pamela Hagg's work, and Radley Balco's not a historian, but he does great historical work, is that this isn't something that's specific to even the 90s. It's not specific to the 2000s. It's not even specific to our moment. We can kind of, well, Balco would suggest that it really can be pinpointed to Lyndon B. Johnson, and specifically the war on crime. And that idea, and this, again, like, where is that coming out of? This is coming out of the 60s and civil unrest in the US, and specifically, again, we go back to California. But the idea, like, if we're pitting a war on crime, who are the combatants? Who is the enemy, right? It's the enemy is other citizens. They're other Americans, right? But they're the criminal Americans, as opposed to like the frontline soldiers who become the police. Johnson's war on crime, that gets carried over into Nixon, and Nixon carries that on, but that then becomes also the war on drugs, continued into Reagan. And we know for a fact that both the war on crime and the so-called war on drugs affects specific populations. It's easy to kind of say the criminal element, but these are real people with real lives and real histories, and they're being pinpointed with a kind of again a sort of ideological underbearing. And it's important to think that not only that this is the kind of milieu that also creates the SWAT units, and again, I believe LA, certainly California, that again, like this idea of like the sort of arms race, where it's like criminals are getting sophisticated, so law enforcement needs to get just as sophisticated. What is like the kind of real flashpoint that this is all coming out of in the 60s? It's the Watts riots, So this is from the very beginning an incredibly kind of racially charged let's say thinking that where the racial the race sort of is easily erased under this kind of broad category of criminalization. It's not a coincidence that this is all really explodes or becomes really apparent to us, right? Again, this is something that's been going on, but I think in the same way that with Rodney King and the riots then, again in LA and in California, and that video made apparent what some people in the country already knew, but a lot, just weren't aware of. I think in a similar sense, it's not that these are new developments, but they become so much more apparent or pointed, and concentrated. And so it's not a coincidence that Way of the Gun, one of the reasons that it's so interesting is that it's 2000, and I mentioned this in the email as well. It's almost as if it anticipates what's going to happen in the next 10 years, which of course gets really exploded after the September 11 attacks and the war on terror. So this kind of continuity that becomes the war on crime, the war on drugs, and then the war on terror. We're always at war, right? And so really, again, kind of what all of this is about in some sense, meaning all of these films or the history, we're really talking about the us versus them distinction, and partially, who gets designated us and who gets designated them at what moment and why, and more specifically in terms of when we're talking about militarism and militarization and these techniques and these weapons, we're talking about this idea of how is it that we, quote unquote, us fight them, quote unquote. And one of the things that's and again, to kind of loop it back to Way of the Gun, one of the reasons that the film is valuable is that it gets a real glimpse into what warfare looks like in the last 20 years. And specifically, I'm thinking about, and one of the reasons the film is lauded is the way that Parker and Longbow move through spaces. Again, both Painter's office, but of course the brothel at the end. And the degree of sophistication where they move through the space and they clear the space is fundamentally urban warfare. And if we think about, again, like the changing sort of battlegrounds, whether it's, Vietnam, or the Pacific Theater in World War II, or the Korean War, right? Warfare in the last 20 years has decidedly been urban warfare. And so the fact that it's not just that like a lot of people tend to kind of focus on the weaponry, right? That law enforcement is sort of equipping the armored vehicles, the MRAPs, and also, but we don't think too much about the techniques and the continuity, right? It's not only a fact that law enforcement can easily take on military surplus, but they're using the same techniques too. And what I mean by this is that the same way that Longbow and Parker are moving through buildings, so are American GIs through crowded spaces in guerrilla warfare in the Middle East, and so too are law enforcement and SWAT. Balco talks about this extensively in terms of raids, no-knock raids, and all of those things, and how people are going through spaces. This gets us to, I think, another kind of because for me, when I'm thinking about these things, it's difficult to disassociate it. I can't compartmentalize and say like, well, film is separate from the military, is separate from law enforcement. But when we're talking about really like, these last 20 years, if not more, of aggression in the US, then, which again, it's contemporaneous. These aren't coincidences, right? We have to talk about the ugly sort of reality of mass shooters, right? So a question that keeps coming up is why, there's a pattern. It's not just the fact that mass shootings are happening, but why is it that all of these, shooters tend to use the same weapon over and over and over, the AR-15? And we could talk about the AR-15 all day as well. I'm only going to talk about it a little bit. And, not a mass shooter, but another kind of really ugly, another real wart, right, on our national history. More recently, again, going back to Kenosha, Kyle Rittenhouse, the miner who was also using an AR-style rifle. The man on his right is also using an AR-style rifle. They're both, observing trigger discipline. And even if we go back to, those images of Portland or I'm getting it mixed up. I think it's Portland, could be Seattle. Or go back to Ferguson, all of the officers are using trigger discipline too. And to me, that's one of those things where a lot of the criticism gets on training. It's like that they're not properly trained. And I think that's half right. The thing is that no, like, again, even Kyle Rittenhouse and this, presumably, I have no idea, but presumably a militiaman on the right, these people are also trained in things like trigger discipline. There's a passing knowledge of the modern technique and safety. And I think it's less that and much more like, if we're talking about training, we have to really get to the ideological training of how we are thinking about other people. This idea of these divisions, that are entirely historical, entirely contingent, which means they can change. And they do change constantly. Like allies change, enemies change, right? And so in that sense, like, everyone thinks about the AR-15 and asks this question. This is the AR-15, this is the Colt model. But what people always kind of miss is like, yeah, I don't think it's that hard to answer the question. Well, it's because the AR-15 is a civilian model of the M4. They're both from Colt. And there are all sorts of civilian, derivatives, but it goes back to the original Colt design, which Colt purchased from Armalite, which is where the AR designation come from. And the M4 is important. Why? Because it's like the widely ubiquitously used weapon of the American military and also law enforcement in the US. And there's this long tradition, and we can kind of loop back into cinema between, again, whether it's law enforcement, military, and cinema, this kind of project of, I mean, we can talk about it, right? The Eisenhower military-industrial complex. It's the Colt AR-15 or the Colt M4 is in it of itself an offshoot of the M16. Why is the M16 important? Because similarly, it's the gun that basically kind of characterized and defined, 80s action cinema. One of, there were many. But as far as assault rifles were concerned. And why is that important? Because, well, it was one of Rambo's key guns other than the M60. the machine gun. And why is that important? Because Rambo was a Vietnam vet, and the M16 was the rifle that was used to great degree in the Vietnam War. And if we go back even further, I would suggest that we have the same sort of genealogy or lineage that goes to the Colt Single Action Army, which is, you know, the revolver, the 6-shooter that we see littered through, you know, kind of westerns, right? And this legend of the American gunslinger, which, again, you know, we can talk about it a little bit further in the discussion, and I'm almost wrapping up. But you know, the image of the kind of like mystified, reified, heroic gunslinger, which clearly carries on, and we know this because, you know, one of the films that Way of the Gun really pings off of is Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid. It doesn't actually correspond to history, or rather, if you know, like a historian like Pamela Hagg shows that American gun culture was entirely invented by companies like Colt and Winchester. And so, you know, that kind of relationship, I think the New York Times came pretty close, where, you know, without actually saying, but, you know, in this headline, yeah, like, why is it that mass shooters are using rifles that are used by infantry troops, but not just any infantry troops, but American infantry troops? There's something being invoked here. And so, you know, to kind of loop into where this is all coming from, right? The M4 or the AR-15 is the premier gun featured in basically all of American cinema that takes up the war on terror in the last 20 years. There's even a line, and this will be the last thing that I say before we move on to questions. There's a line even in Bowling for Columbine where Michael Moore kind of thinks about this issue. And he thinks about, you know, where did Columbine, like, how did this happen? And there's a line where he talks about where, well, American culture is violent culture, right? And I would like for us to kind of think of that and approach that question a little bit more capaciously, a little bit more kind of willing to really get into the weeds, where it's not, I don't think it's just a problem of, I don't think it's just a problem of gun rights. I don't think it's a problem just of the police being militarized. I think it's far more kind of expansive, and for us to kind of be, it's like a, you know, like a hydra, right? A many-headed hydra. We have to kind of talk about these things all at the same time if we do, in fact, want to make a dent into all of the violence that we've been just sort of really hopelessly and witnessing in the last few years. So that's what I have, and we can move on to questions. Thanks for listening.
Thanks so much, Seth. I forgot to cue up my canned applause, but I can imagine everyone at home is clapping in great appreciation for everything that you brought to this discussion tonight. I just want to remind everyone at home, if you do want to ask a question, which we encourage you to do, use the Q&A button on the bottom of the screen to type your question, and that'll just kind of help us keep track, because there are quite a few of us in this webinar right now. But while we wait for some, I guess maybe I have a question for you, Seth.
Sure.
And Julia, if you have one as well, feel free to jump in. You know, obviously, I take your point about how everything is contingent, and I wonder, you know, I think you explained it really well in terms of the context of how this film predicts some of the situation that we're experiencing today with, you know, as it relates to gun violence, as it relates to popular culture, movie culture, and its handling of guns. But I wonder about the other things, the other, you know, really kind of difficult topics that I think were very prevalent in the film, like human trafficking. I think the film has a complicated dealing with gender roles, with sexuality, with race, with wealth and economic class. So I wonder if you wanted to touch on any, you know, how the film in 2000 touches on these issues today, whether or not it is contingent with, you know, the kind of evolution, or, you know, with its treatment of guns. I would say.
I can't really speak to human trafficking because that's an area that I'm just not, I don't have enough under my belt to be able to kind of responsibly speak to. I do think, in terms of gender, um, I think it's striking and noteworthy that as much as it's, how do I put this? It could very easily invite, and I guess it relates to like the contingent of history, or contingent like nature of history. It's very easy to watch a film like this and think, especially for us as sort of modern viewers, 20 years removed, look at how dated this is, look at how backwards this is, look at how unsophisticated the film is in the way that it talks about gender, and race. And just to be very clear, the way that I feel is that, I mean, I think the film very clearly has, kind of, how do I put this? A sort of sexist, homophobic, and racist streak to it. Um, and yet, for me personally, I find that, it's much harder to find, similar to like the gun stuff. It's much harder to find films that, at least for me, don't fit that criteria. Even films that other people kind of assume to be like, this film has good politics. Generally, I find that that's not the case. But what I'm trying to get at is that, and yet the film is clearly aware of that, right? And there's almost, I think, even a contempt, because this is still within, after politically correct culture. And with the scene in the clinic where Parker kind of goes off into his homophobic diatribe, but then there's this sort of very, I think, late 90s, early 2000s, hipper than and smarter than you kind of commenting on the commenting that's going on. That, and I'm bringing that up just to say that, to me, like, and so it's the less productive reading is, look how racist this is or sexist this is, and they didn't know better. It's, they're talking about it too, and that gives us an opportunity that perhaps we need to talk about this stuff more too, than simply in a kind of like, in let's say in too, how do I put it? Too quick, like too fast and loose in terms of that sort of question.
Yeah, I really appreciate that that insight, because it's a rich film. I mean, it really has a lot going on, and you can't take it all at surface value, even though, for the reasons you mentioned, it's
Right.
shocking and it's easy to dismiss. But
Right.
we have a couple of questions here. So Eric asks, you mentioned a few phrases that I'm interested in: point shooting, handgun combat, civilian shooting culture. Could you elaborate on those specifications or distinctions?
Sure. So point shooting, and then the last point shooting, handgun combat, and then what was the civilian gun culture, right? So proponents of Cooper's modern technique refer to, they refer to it as the modern technique, but they also refer to it as sight shooting. And this is a distinction, and I think that a lot of people will actually train both. But it's, even though like the modern technique is what's popular and kind of dominant, that doesn't mean that it's like a settled discussion. There's still a great amount of debate in gun circles. But like the fundamental difference would be, if you watch like, there are two kind of things to look out for, which one is like, are both hands being used? So in Cooper's technique, both hands are being engaged. Two is the handgun being aimed and fired with vision on sight? So it's like, is it being raised and fired as you see in like all the films that we see? As opposed to, if you look at most 20th century films, where it's like, if you look at the kind of like, not only like hip firing, but just kind of like general pointing and shooting, that would be the main distinction. And the idea is that, or like the kind of dominant philosophy between the two is with point shooting. It's I mean, both are about speed, but just kind of like, oh, I think I remember now. It's based in the idea that like a person can generally point to like with a great deal of precision. So if you can point your finger at something and be able to draw the line, right, then you'll be able to shoot and hit it as well, as opposed to with sight shooting. So Cooper's school kind of takes up the idea that like, no, that's just far too inaccurate, and in combat, in real live combat, it's accuracy that matters. Because it's like if you're fast and you miss, it doesn't matter, right? The other person has a shot, has a chance. So it's the idea that if you can focus and train on aiming with front sights, right? And then the stances differ, and then all sorts of other things kind of, come along with that. Handgun combat in the sense that uh, the handgun as the primary tool of engagement, and so like even in military, as opposed to a long gun, so an assault rifle, that you would actually train with the handgun, that it's not simply kind of that it can actually serve a real combat function as opposed to sort of secondary functions. I think analogous, and Cooper, interestingly enough, actually talks about. I mean, I've thought this for years, and it's not that like handgun combat is a form of martial art. And Cooper actually like says it himself that like handguns are, or handgun combat in the defense, the modern technique is a martial art. And so in that sense, it comes with all of like these sort of, again, like practices and at this point, I think traditions as well. And then when I was talking about, I think I kind of lost my train of thought on that one. And maybe we can move back, but civilian gun culture, um, I'm going to imagine that most people in the room have been have participated in some sort of institutional setting. And for example, for us in academia, we know that academia moves with the speed of glaciers, right? For better or worse, sometimes for better, sometimes for worse. Military and law enforcement is no different. And so, the training regimens, like these things aren't just going to be changed overnight. So it's actually, it's among civilians and the enthusiasts that are really like grinding and developing and training and refining, in law enforcement, or I think, people talk about this, right? It's like you're not paid enough. There are not enough time, there are not enough hours in the day. And so the kind of myth around Cooper is that, he was tired of the sort of lack of training, or general poor training. And so he started creating a civilian shooting competition in the 50s and 60s in California, which became a real hotbed, where people were trading their techniques, and that's where a lot of the modern technique was formed. The modern technique is generally associated with the Weaver stance, which is the way that which interestingly enough maps onto a boxer's stance. So again, that kind of martial connection. But the way that you'll everyone in the film in Way of the Gun are using Weaver stance, as opposed to like an isosceles stance, or again a point shooting stance. So an isosceles where you're just kind of like, almost like a triangle, just like standing immediately boxed forward like this, as opposed to a Weaver which moves like this. So those sort of distinctions, but that comes from Jack Weaver, who was, I believe, a sheriff again in California, who developed that stance on his own and was beating people left and right in these competitions, which got Cooper to rethink, like, well, what's he doing that's so effective? And that basically became disseminated to the point where it's now universal. And I don't just mean in the US, but like, around the world.
Thanks for that. Isaac has a question. So do you suspect that the Way of the Gun is marketed to a specific political group or political leaning, or is it marketed to society in general, America as a country?
That's a good question, and it immediately makes me think of Elisa Perrin has this like brilliant article about Miramax, and what Miramax did to basically change the entirety of American independent cinema, specifically with Sex, Lies, and Videotape, and how they marketed Sex, Lies, and Videotape. And for me, I would totally agree with Perrin in the sense that it's Miramax specifically, which is the legacy of the Weinsteins that people generally don't want to talk about because it's too it's too troubling and disquieting. But that's the truth, is that, yeah, Tarantino, but it's like the Weinsteins had, were instrumental to American independent cinema as you and I recognize it today. And that kind of, you see the lineage, right, where it's like from Tarantino, and then again people like Doug Liman, people like Macquarie, and going from Soderbergh, right? I would have to, I mean, I have the poster, not in the office, but I mean, if we to like sufficiently answer that question, we would have to look at the marketing. But my guess is that it wasn't political, that it wouldn't have been a political marketing, and much more of a kind of like hip, well, Macquarie talks about this, that he basically, this was 5 years after Usual Suspects. I don't think he does anything else, and he was so successful after writing The Usual Suspects that basically the only thing he could get funded was a crime film. And so I can almost guarantee, even without looking at it, that it was probably like, you enjoy The Usual Suspects, you enjoy the Pulp Fiction, and Reservoir Dogs. Like, that's what's being marketed here. But as Isaac, you're kind of pointing out, there are all sorts of other stuff going on that might not have been kind of explicitly apparent. Now, again, and that's what kind of, leads into the pivot into the war on terror. It's like, that changes like immensely, right? But in 2000, we're still like here's this hip, edgy film, right?
Yeah, and I think right along those lines, we have another question. So thanks for connecting the dots in terms of this dynamic interaction between civilian militarization and gun culture inspiring films. I'm curious if there's a parallel thread of films over time that have been critical of American gun culture.
That's a really good question. And I think probably is the answer. And I say that because it's like, if there are, it's not a string that's as readily apparent as these films. Because I think it's like, if you ask it, are there films that are critical of the war on terror? There are plenty of those. But especially if we look at it as expansively as we're trying to, in sense of just like gun technique and culture, I think it becomes more specifically located in something like police militarization. There was that documentary a few years ago. Mike, do you remember? Don't Shoot Hands Up? There was one. There was one of those, and then again we have something like Bowling for Columbine and other kind of documentaries, but nothing that takes up, I think, the question as, I think, pervasive as it actually is, unfortunately.
Daniel has a question. So where do films with physically impossible shooting like Wanted and Dark Tower fit into the discussion?
Yeah, and I think that those films, in fact, that one Pew Pew Tactical blog, it starts off by trashing Wanted. And I have a kind of, if we go back to Tom Cruise for a second, and Christopher McQuarrie for that matter, Jack Reacher, and bring back The Hunted. One of the reasons that Jack Reacher is interesting is that it shows you it shows in two lines of action in American cinema coincide in Jack Reacher. And specifically, so what were the films that were doing well, action films? In 1999 is The Matrix, 2000 is Crouching Tiger, Yuen Woo-ping becomes a huge person in the US, and Wire Fu like proliferates very briefly. Charlie's Angels, right? The War, Art of War with Wesley Snipes, right? And so you have, on one end, like Mission Impossible 2 with John Woo, that sort of gunplay, and then you have Wire Fu. After 2001, 2003, you have The Hunted. 2002 is Born Identity. So Dan, was that your question, Rash? Yes, it is. It was your question. So you'll appreciate this. Like, Filipino martial arts becomes the default way of portraying action in American cinema after 2001. That coincides with the Michael Mann, Christopher McQuarrie, Jeff Cooper school of shooting. Both of those collide in Jack Reacher, where basically he's using like Tom Cruise is using all of those techniques in one film. And the way that I see it is that basically, like, we as an audience, and I mean globally, not just in US, kind of, for some reason at this point, basically say like unrealistic sort of, or quote unquote unrealistic kind of hokey combat just isn't good enough. Not in the times that we live in, right? Like, we need more sophisticated fighters, which is why we have Jack Reacher, John Wick, any of the J characters, I suppose. James Bond is another of my favorite. Jason Bourne, like, So I wouldn't go so far as to say that's the reason why Dark Tower didn't do well, but I don't think it's a coincidence. And Wanted is kind of like a joke at this point. People just talk about curbing the bullet. As opposed to like The Matrix, for the most part, the first film still has sort of secured its legacy. Wanted, on the other hand, like no one talks about that film anymore, right? I mean, I like it. I think it's fine.
Joel has an interesting question. So he says, I appreciate your life imitates art perspective of film and television, influencing how we view violence and use of guns. I'm also wondering how you look at film and television's frequent disregard for constitutional safeguards, especially regarding legal searches and or violence against suspects.
Yeah, I mean, I think I won't go. I mean, I think you're on the right track, Joel. That I think I was just speaking to a colleague. She may be here, and it's something that I get from Steve Cho, the film researcher. But a lot of my research comes down to kind of locating what we as audiences make exceptions for. And I think, let's say the Constitution as something that can be constantly trampled or challenged. I think in a similar sense, to me, a lot of what I'm ultimately talking about is, I think that we can understand the kind of callousness towards human life that we've continuously seen. And to be very clear, I'm not saying this is a 21st century phenomenon. I think the callousness towards other human life is something that we see over and over and over. But we can understand like our particular 21st century callousness towards human life. And I do think that the kind of ideological maneuvers of media help us understand that. And again, not necessarily as a monkey see, monkey do, that films do this and that's why we think this way, so much as like it's a much more kind of reciprocated and dynamic interchange between the two. I mean, I'm always saying in every class, and some of my students are here, and thank you guys for coming. It's like, what do our films tell us about ourselves? Which loops back to Mike, actually, your first question, which is, to me, it's like, I want to watch Way of the Gun and understand something about my own self. And to that, like, if there's sort of ugly tendencies like, discriminatory, kind of language or thinking, I want to take that instance to think about where can I be more shored up in terms of the way that I interact with other people. But I think that for the most part, the mission of cinema, American cinema, or just like dominant cinema, has not been that, but so much as like, yeah, what about, like those people over there? And that's really what all of this is about, is how we make those kind of exceptions and say those people, they're the problem. I don't think that's the most productive way forward, personally.
So Chris asks, would it be fair to say that Way of the Gun, besides dramatizing differences between things like youth or relative lack of experience and age or experience, dramatizes as well different gun cultures, ways of handling guns, ways of moving around spaces? And is it making any kinds of claims or critiques in relation to the changes in gun culture that you're describing?
I think that's absolutely fair, Chris. And in fact, funnily enough, I think that's you give us the perfect opportunity to talk about preferred readings and dominant readings. So I just read the day before Macquarie's interview that he did on the press junket for Mission Impossible. It was in 2015. He was like looking in retrospective Way of the Gun. And he actually reads the film exactly the way that you're suggesting. So I do think it's a correct reading to say that, well, the film is about youth and experience. And he said he didn't see it when he was making it. He was kind of mapping himself on to Parker and Longbaugh, that they were kind of, his muses and speaking for his experiences in Hollywood. But now he can see that like really the protagonist in some senses is the Khan character. This is one of those things as a film researcher you always think about, where it's like, well, you wonder, like, would the filmmakers be amenable to a reading such as mine? So that's the thing, is that like, I don't think that the film itself, or yeah, I think maybe, yeah, I think the film, if the film is making a comment about gun culture and representation of guns it is, in as much as it's kind of also dumping on Hollywood to that point, and like this is the proper way to do it. I don't think it's going beyond that though. Personally, I don't think the film suggests anything that there's like a critique of gun culture.
Great. Matthew asks, what do you think about the distinction Longbow and Joe draw between themselves and other gun nuts, and how that may have been received by the audience then versus now?
Yeah, absolutely. I think there's one of my favorite lines in the film is when Longbow says, "People just want to be criminals more than they want to do crime," and so there's absolutely this distinction. And I don't think it's like, if we kind of, think of it metaphorically, they're not just talking about criminals. It's like, because Sarno actually responds, that's the world. That's not just criminals. There is this kind of dig being made at the idea of like fakeness, right? Of people who don't walk the walk, right? And clearly the two of them are which goes back to my original point. Is like, it's kind of funny that how can you be 2-bit hoods and also like incredibly professional? Because that's one of the things that the film has in contradistinction to Michael Mann's films, where it's like those films are about the consummate kind of male professional. This film is about like hoodlums who are just very good at this specific thing. But I think that's the thing, and this goes back to kind of my point about us versus them, or making the exception. If you look at dominant gun discourse, if you look at the kind of discussions around militarization, police training, military training, no one is saying like, yeah, I'm the gun nut. No one is saying like, I'm the problem. Everyone is going to identify with Sarno and Longbow. And to go back to preferred readings and alternative readings, the film also is not going to go back to the question of politics. The film is not going to go out of its way to alienate part of its audience. They need their ticket money. And that to me is like one of those things I always try and point out about films, is that like, we're the ones that bring the politics into the films and read it either as like, pro this or pro that. The films are always nebulous, like, and to go into another post 9/11 film, like 300 was immensely popular. And the way that I put it, like, when films are immensely popular, they're popular on both sides of the aisle. It's not just like the left or just the right go to see these films. And the dominant reading of that film was kind of split in half, where it's like, who are the Americans in this case, and who represents the Middle East? Some people read, the Spartans as Americans. Some people read them as the Middle East. Some people read the Persians as Americans. Some people read them as the Middle East. And meanwhile, I can't remember what the studio for 300 is, but like the studio is, they're just counting their money, right? So I think the films do that sort of thing where it's like, they kind of like put it in front of you, and then it's up to you to identify. So my point is that, and this goes back to Chris, your question too, blogs like Pew Pew Tactical, and there are like videos too of like gun enthusiasts who talk about the film. They're identifying with the film and taking it up as a good object, and not because they think Sarno and Longbow are talking about them. I don't think anyone watches a film like this and thinks, like, they're talking about me, I'm the problem.
We have a few more questions. I want to be respectful of your time, and I know you've been.
No, I'm
Okay.
all the time.
Awesome. So Luther has a kind of like interdisciplinary question here. So after Columbine, we immediately accepted that Harris had created Doom level, so Doom the video game, based on the school layout, although this proved not to be true. At the same time, any trip into a contemporary online first-person shooter FPS will reveal a general lack of knowledge of contemporary firearms techniques. So I'm wondering what thoughts you have about the role of video games playing into this paradigm, not of course in the Jack Thompson sense, but as of interweaving with popular film and police militarization.
Yeah, absolutely. So this is a part of a broader project. And when I say like how pervasive this is, I mean it's really pervasive. And so part of the project looks at Michael Mann primarily and Way of the Gun. Part of the project looks at television, and The Walking Dead is something I specifically look at. But there was even like this, I was watching television one day, and it was an ABC sitcom, and it was like a sitcom about a mom who's a police officer, and there was this weird thing where it's like, I can't remember if she was like using like a Nerf gun or something, but it's like an ABC, you know, I don't even know if it's a primetime sitcom, and it's just like moving incredibly sophisticatedly. Part of the project is also I look at children's toys, so I look at Nerf guns, and I specifically look at the engineering of Nerf guns. And then I also like a big project is video games, and you know, this will be of interest to you. You know, I talk about Grand Theft Auto quite a bit. I talk about The Last of Us in another related project, and I also talk about Call of Duty. And I actually think that a lot of I would say is that if we look almost kind of in a broader sense, like a holistically, there are certain things that the average video game player who plays shooters, in terms of their training, does not have in place. There are quite a few things. But on the other hand, there are quite a few things that people do have in place. And when we really consider what that means, it's kind of frightening. And you know, the sort of, everyone talks about the army using, and the armed forces using video games as recruitment tools, and again, it's kind of couched on this sort of monkey see, monkey do paradigm. But I don't think it's just that. I think it's that the way that I would put it is that someone who's extensively played an online shooter, there's some things they already know that they have been trained in. And specifically, I'm thinking of something like a tactical reload or a speed reload, proper cover and fire, proper movement, proper squad techniques. They might not be proper, they might not be textbook, but they know more than like for some, you know, than like a layman who has no training. And that's what I'm trying to get at, is that like when millions and millions of people are playing these games or watching these films, it's like we're kind of more privy to this stuff than not. And to that, to the kind of, you know, Klebold Harris, well, you know, they did this because of Doom, they did this because of Marilyn Manson. That goes again back to like a really, really kind of poor reading of the relationship between, you know, what cognitively actually goes on when we watch media. You know, it's not a simple, you know, someone watches anything and immediately translates that into action. Like people are just like the human psyche is far too complicated for it to be that way. But to me, it's like, again, the kind of through line between all of these things, it's not even to me like aggressive behavior, because there have been studies. I think at this point it's been pretty decisively concluded that in fact there is a spike in aggression in playing violent video games. It's not that. It's more the kind of, again, to me, like the ideological callousness of the assumption that there are other people that mean to do me harm, and that the only way to deal with those people is not diplomacy, not, you know, commonality, not discussion, but rather violence. That kind of readiness. And I again, I don't think that's limited to someone like Harris, Klebold, any number of these people, right? So yeah.
Teresa asks, what are your thoughts on how guns were used in the Matrix series?
I think it's almost like, right, I mean, even if we think about 1999, you know, and not just in the kind of like Y2K sense, but you know, the Asian financial crisis already happened in Asia. The bubble or the Japan's going through its kind of lost decade. We have the housing collapse right around the corner, and yet for some reason, you know, and again, we're after Rodney King, we're after the LA riots. I'm trying to think of like what else is going on historically, but that kind of like neoliberal moment, for some reason we like to think of it. You know, it's like people keep talking about like 2020 as this, like, you know, and 2020 has been terrible, but it's like, find me a year that's been like great, right? To be honest, is the way that I think. I know that's a kind of like terrible to say, but I think like, I don't know, reading too much history will do that, right? Is it like, whoa, well, this happened and then this happened. But I think the Matrix kind of is indicative, and I think Luther and I were just talking about Joshua Clover. Clover talks about this thing too, where it's like there's that point in the Matrix where they talk about like the Matrix was was created to represent the ideal moment in human history. Clover makes a remark similar to the fact that the Matrix itself is like representing this idealized moment in world civilization. And so like I think the gun violence, we can barely call it that, right? Which is why people make it, you know, make the sort of allusions to, well, it's like a video game. That's why people have no real sense of consequences. That's why like people are getting warped because they watch these films and they think life is like a video game. Again, I think it's way too simple of a reading. But it's almost as if like the film is a simpler time, and the violence reflects that, right? Where it's like, you know, you shoot someone, they come back, you know, Agent Smith comes back, and it's like there's no real gravity, there's no gore, there's no violence, there's no sense of real suffering or repercussions, right? And it's, I think it's much more difficult to do a film like that in 2000 or after 2000. But to me personally, I don't think it should have ever been easy to do a film like that. There, you know, gun violence has been plaguing us for how many decades now, right?
So maybe we'll answer these last two questions together. Sure. How has your viewing of the film changed since when you first saw it and when you're looking at it today in the context of your scholarly work, in the context of this discussion? And how do you think the role of guns affects society in cinema today?
For the first question, oh, go ahead. Did you want to add something?
No.
For the first question, I think I don't remember when I first watched the film. I don't remember it having that much of a, excuse me, lasting effect on me. I think I just watched it, and then the funny thing is that would have been around when I was either getting ready to be enlisted, or like right around my military service, because like right around the period the film was released. But I even though I was interested in martial arts, even then I wasn't really that interested in gun combat per se, and so nothing really stood out. I wouldn't have had the training and the eyes enough to kind of recognize that something is different in this film, or Heat for that matter, during this period. I would have just watched it as the kind of budding, you know, film nerd who liked, you know, Tarantino, and I liked Doug Liman at the point. I hadn't quite discovered Soderbergh yet. It was some point, and I'm pretty sure that, because Eric, this is your question, you were there for it. It was in the period at Iowa when I was like really thinking about a lot of these things, and all of it kind of came together, and I realized like, oh, there's something real going on here. The year matters, the context matters, the politics matter, where all these people go and what kind of films they do matter, and I started like slowly compiling that research then. Watching it 2 days ago, even though I remembered, and this goes back to Mike, your point, I was kind of surprised at how forceful the opening is, and again, in terms of the kind of language and sentiments, and that to me kind of suggested, you know, even within, because like when I was working on this in Iowa, that was about 5 to 10 years ago, is again like it gave me another moment to kind of reflect on what kind of, you know, socio-cultural political moment that we're currently in, is like how we think about these things, that this film feels, and I'm sure a lot of people had similar responses in watching it. It's like, this feels a lot more pointed than I remember it, which is, I think, yeah, that's a good thing, right? As far as like guns in film and characters today, yeah, I mean, I'll give you just another like related example, but because I'm teaching Korean cinema this semester, there are a number of Korean films that go out of their way, whether it's generically or historically, so that the heroes can have guns. Because Korea is a culture, it's a country where there are no guns other than civilians can't have guns, only military and police can have guns. And that points to this sort of desire, right? Or an association. And again, whether it's police officers, whether it's soldiers, whether it's gunslingers, guns are associated with, you know, the kind of peacekeepers. And a broader question that I kind of pose is, again, like, why aren't our heroes, and I mean, you know, in our media, not just in actuality, why aren't our heroes diplomats? Why aren't our heroes conversationalists or great orators? The counter question is, why are our heroes, you know, to be honest, in most cinema, why are heroes murderers? So if that answers your question.
Well, Seth, I just want to say thank you so much on behalf of all of us at the Maine Film Center for your research, your scholarship, for bringing everything here and sharing it with the community today. I have a lot to think about.
Great, yeah.
So I really appreciate that. I just want to quickly plug for everyone. On September 30th, we're going to be continuing cinema and conversation with a new film called Entangled, which kind of follows up Lobster War, which if you were in Waterville a couple of years ago, you may have seen it at Railroad Square Cinema. The director, David Abel, who's a reporter for the Boston Globe, will be here for a discussion with us that evening at 7:30. But again, if you look at the chat, Julia just posted a link to it. So thanks, Julia. But again, Seth, this is incredible. Thank you for kicking off this first ever series that we're making up before all of your own very eyes. I think it went really well, and we're really grateful to you. So thanks for doing this.
Thanks for having me. Thank you, everyone, for coming.
All right. Take care, everyone.
Good night.
Drive safe.
Thanks.